There is a moment, buried somewhere between 2 and 3 million years ago, when one of our ancestors did something no member of their lineage had ever done before. They picked up a sharp stone, pressed it against the carcass of a dead animal, and pulled it across the hide until the flesh underneath came free. Whether they ate it raw or eventually learned to cook it is a separate question for later. What matters about that moment is that it marks a turning point in the story of our species so significant that some researchers argue it is the single most important dietary shift in the history of human evolution, one whose consequences are still visibly written into the shape of our skulls, the size of our brains, the length of our digestive systems, and the structure of our teeth in ways that have not disappeared even after millions of years of change. Our earliest ancestors were not meat eaters, and understanding why meat eating began requires understanding what came before it. The primates that preceded the human lineage were predominantly plant eaters, and the evidence for this is built right into their anatomy. Large, powerful jaw muscles attached to prominent bony crests running along the top of the skull allowed them to generate enormous crushing force for processing tough vegetation, fibrous roots, and hard seeds. Their digestive systems were long and specialized for breaking down complex plant materials slowly, extracting nutrients from food that required significant processing time before it gave up its calories. The teeth of our early primate ancestors were built for grinding, with large flat molars and relatively small canines compared to dedicated carnivores, and the picture that emerges from the fossil record of their diet is one of committed, specialized herbivory rather than anything approaching the flexible omnivory that would later define the human lineage. Something began changing around 3.5 to 4 million years ago in the environments where our ancestors lived, and that environmental shift is the key to understanding why meat entered the human diet at all. The African climate was becoming drier, forests were retreating, and the open savannas and grasslands were expanding dramatically across a landscape that had previously been much more heavily wooded. This mattered enormously because a forest environment is rich in the kinds of plant foods our ancestors were already specialized to eat: fruits, leaves, soft vegetation, and tree-dwelling insects. While a savanna environment is comparatively poor in those foods, but rich in something else entirely: large grazing animals, and the carcasses those animals left behind when they died or were killed by predators. The earliest evidence for meat eating in the human lineage doesn't come from hunting at all, and this is one of the most important and often misunderstood points about how this dietary transition actually began. Cut marks found on animal bones dating to approximately 2.5 million years ago, discovered at sites in Ethiopia and Kenya, show that early hominins were using sharp stone flakes to scrape meat from bones and smash those bones open to access the marrow inside. But the pattern of these cut marks tells researchers something crucial. They were often made on top of, or alongside, tooth marks from large carnivores like leopards and saber-toothed cats, which means these early hominins were not hunting these animals themselves. They were scavenging the leftovers from predators that had already made their kills. Early meat eating appears to have begun not with the dramatic image of a coordinated hunt across the open savanna, but with something far more cautious and opportunistic. A small-brained hominin approaching a carcass already worked over by a lion, driving off whatever scavengers remained, and extracting what nutritional value was left in the bones and scraps the larger predators had left behind. This scavenging origin matters for understanding the full story because bone marrow, which is what these early hominins were specifically targeting by smashing open the large leg bones of animals, is one of the most calorie-dense and nutritionally complete foods available anywhere in the natural world. A single large femur from a wildebeest or an ancient buffalo ancestor contains a core of fatty, protein-rich marrow that delivers a concentrated nutritional payload that almost nothing in the plant food world can match gram for gram. Fat in particular was extraordinarily difficult to obtain in sufficient quantities from a purely plant-based diet on the open savanna, where the most available plant foods tended to be fibrous, starchy, and relatively low in the kind of dense caloric energy that a growing brain demands. Bone marrow appears to have been the nutritional gateway drug of human evolution, the first high-density animal food that offered a reward large enough to make the risk of approaching a predator's kill worth taking. What happened next, over the following million or more years, was one of the most consequential feedback loops in the history of life on this planet. Better nutrition from animal foods supported larger, more energetically expensive brains. Larger brains enabled better tools, better planning, and eventually better hunting strategies. Better hunting strategies provided more reliable access to meat. More reliable access to meat supported the continued growth of brain tissue. Brain tissue is the most metabolically expensive tissue in the human body, requiring approximately 20% of the body's entire energy budget despite making up only about 2% of body weight. Each step in this cycle reinforced the next, and the physical evidence of this feedback loop is preserved in the fossil record as a clear trend of increasing cranial capacity across the hominin lineage, with the most dramatic expansions of brain size correlating closely with the periods of greatest increase in evidence for meat eating and more sophisticated tool use. The physical transformation that meat eating drove across the human body went far beyond just brain size, and it left marks on virtually every part of our anatomy that are still visible today. As animal foods became a more reliable and important part of the diet, the massive jaw muscles and skull crests that earlier hominins needed for processing tough vegetation began to shrink because they were no longer necessary for the same grinding work. Perhaps most dramatically, the human gut shortened significantly compared to our great ape relatives because a diet higher in easily digestible, nutrient-dense animal protein requires less fermentation time and less total gut length to process than a diet dominated by fibrous plant material. The energy freed up by maintaining a shorter gut appears to have been redirected, at least in part, toward the enormous ongoing metabolic cost of the expanding brain. A biological trade-off researchers have called the expensive tissue hypothesis, where the body essentially downsized one expensive organ to fund the growth of another. By the time Homo erectus appears in the fossil record approximately 1.5 to 2 million years ago, the hominin relationship with meat had shifted dramatically from opportunistic scavenging towards something far more active and intentional. Evidence suggests Homo erectus was capable of organized group hunting, coordinating multiple individuals to pursue and corner large game in ways that individual scavenging never could have achieved. The invention of the Acheulean hand axe, a more sophisticated and deliberately shaped stone tool that appears alongside Homo erectus in the fossil record, gave these early humans a far more effective means of processing animal carcasses quickly and efficiently, suggesting that by this point meat was not a lucky supplement to the diet, but a planned and central component of it. Fire changed everything again, in ways that are still not fully appreciated by most people thinking about early human meat eating. Cooking fundamentally transforms the caloric and nutritional yield of animal protein in ways that have enormous biological consequences. When meat is cooked, its proteins denature and become dramatically easier for the digestive system to extract energy from, increasing the effective caloric yield of the same piece of meat by a significant margin compared to eating it raw. Cooked meat is also softer, requiring less chewing time and less jaw muscle force to process, which contributed further to the reduction in jaw size and tooth robustness visible in the fossil record following the widespread adoption of fire. Some researchers, most prominently the biological anthropologist Richard Wrangham, have argued that cooking, and specifically the cooking of meat, may have driven the final and most dramatic phase of human brain expansion, providing the reliable caloric surplus that the extraordinarily expensive human brain required to reach its modern size. What this history reveals is that meat eating was not a simple choice or a cultural preference that early humans adopted because they happened to find animals tasty. It was a response to a dramatically changing environment that made the old plant food diet increasingly unreliable, driven initially by the opportunistic exploitation of nutritional resources that plant eaters and smaller brain competitors were leaving behind or couldn't access. The consequences of that shift were so profound and so physically transformative that they reshaped nearly every aspect of human biology over the following 2.5 million years, producing the large brain, the shortened gut, the reduced jaw muscles, the generalist teeth, and the fundamental metabolic dependency on calorie-dense food that modern humans carry with them today, whether they eat meat or not. The body you inhabit right now was built, in significant part, by the dietary decisions of ancestors who approached a lion's kill with a sharp rock and a very high-stakes appetite for bone marrow, and it has never entirely forgotten that origin, no matter how many generations of agriculture and processed food have layered themselves on top of it in the time since.